Rick Warren spent 42 years building Saddleback Church into something the evangelical world had never seen. 50 million copies of The Purpose-Driven Life sold. 20,000 people showing up every single weekend. 400,000 pastors trained through his conferences. The man didn't just build a megachurch. He built a movement. Then he handed it all to Andy Wood. 8 months later, the succession was already unraveling, and the reason why revealed something uncomfortable about how these empires actually work. September 2022. Rick Warren officially retires. After 4 decades of leading one of the most influential churches in American Christianity, he passes the mantle to Andy Wood, a pastor from Echo Church in San Jose. Wood had the credentials. He had Warren's endorsement. He had the pulpit presence. What he didn't have was any idea what he was actually inheriting. Because here's what nobody mentioned during the celebration services and the carefully staged transition ceremonies. Saddleback Church was already at war with its own denomination, and Andy Wood was walking straight into the crossfire. The trigger point happened 16 months before Wood even took the job. Mother's Day, 2021. Saddleback Church ordained 3 women as pastors, not as directors, not as ministry leaders, pastors, with the title, with the authority, with everything that title implies. Now, for most churches, this wouldn't even make the newsletter, but Saddleback wasn't most churches. Saddleback was affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention, and the Southern Baptist Convention has a document called the Baptist Faith and Message. Article 6 of that document is very specific. The office of pastor is limited to men as qualified by Scripture. That's not a suggestion. That's not a preference. That's the doctrinal foundation of the entire denomination. And Rick Warren knew exactly what he was doing when he crossed that line. But Warren had a calculation. He'd spent 4 decades building relationships, accumulating influence, training hundreds of thousands of SBC pastors personally. He probably assumed the denomination would never actually move against him. Too much history, too much reputation, too much to lose. He was wrong. June 14th, 2023, New Orleans. The Southern Baptist Convention holds its annual meeting, and on the agenda is a motion to expel Saddleback Church from the denomination. The vote wasn't close. 9,437 messengers voted to remove Saddleback. 1,212 voted against. That's 88%. 42 years of affiliation ended in a single afternoon, the largest church ever expelled from the Southern Baptist Convention. And Andy Wood had been senior pastor for exactly 9 months. Think about the position Wood was now in. He didn't ordain those women. That happened before he arrived. He didn't pick this fight. Warren picked it. But Wood was the one standing at the podium when the denomination voted his church out of existence. And it gets worse. Part of what made the ordination so controversial wasn't just the women who were ordained. It was who specifically received the title. Stacy Wood, Andy Wood's wife. She became a teaching pastor at Saddleback after the transition, which meant the new senior pastor's own spouse was now a symbol of the very controversy that got them expelled. Every interview, every press question, every denominational conversation now had this impossible undercurrent. Andy Wood couldn't defend his wife's role without defending the decision that cost them the SBC. He couldn't distance himself from the controversy without distancing himself from his own marriage. Warren put him in a position where there was no clean answer. The attendance numbers tell the rest of the story. And while Saddleback doesn't publish exact figures anymore, the trajectory is clear. The purpose-driven brand that once drew 20,000 people a weekend now carries an asterisk. The church that trained pastors across the globe is now the cautionary tale those same pastors use in their own succession planning. Or Albert Mohler, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and one of the most influential voices in the SBC, didn't mince words. He framed the expulsion as a matter of biblical fidelity. The denomination had no choice. A church cannot openly violate the confession and remain in fellowship. That's not punishment. That's consistency. And here's where Rick Warren's response becomes fascinating. Because he didn't back down. He didn't apologize. He didn't suggest Saddleback made a mistake. Instead, he said this, quote, "The next generation will remove the restriction," end quote. Warren was betting on the future. He was betting that the SBC would eventually change its position and that history would vindicate Saddleback's decision. But Warren is 70 years old. He won't be leading the charge when that battle happens. And he handed that burden to Andy Wood, who is now supposed to keep Saddleback alive long enough for Warren's prophecy to come true. That's not a succession plan. That's a hostage situation. And this pattern keeps repeating, because Saddleback isn't the first megachurch empire to fracture the moment the founder walked away. Crystal Cathedral. Robert Schuller built it into a televised phenomenon. The Hour of Power reached millions of viewers every Sunday morning. The all-glass sanctuary in Garden Grove became an architectural icon, a symbol of prosperity gospel success. Then Schuller retired. He handed leadership to his son, Robert Jr. Within 3 years, there was a family lawsuit. Within 5 years, the ministry filed for bankruptcy. The building, that spectacular glass cathedral that Schuller spent decades fundraising to construct, got sold to the Roman Catholic Diocese of Orange for $57 million. They renamed it Christ Cathedral. The Hour of Power limped along on smaller stations before fading into irrelevance. A ministry that once defined televangelism became a Wikipedia footnote. Mars Hill. Mark Driscoll built one of the most influential young evangelical movements of the 2000s. 15 campuses across 5 states. A publishing empire with New York Times bestsellers. A conference circuit that shaped how an entire generation of pastors thought about church planting. Driscoll was the reformed bad boy, the pastor who cussed from the pulpit and somehow made Calvinism cool. Then allegations mounted. Bullying, plagiarism, a culture of fear and manipulation inside the organization. Driscoll resigned in October 2014, and Mars Hill didn't just decline, it evaporated. By January 2015, every single campus had closed. The entire structure, 15 churches strong, collapsed in less than 3 months. Thousands of members scattered. Staff went unemployed. A movement that seemed unstoppable proved to be built entirely on one man's personality. Willow Creek. Bill Hybels built the seeker-sensitive model that shaped a generation of church growth strategy. The Willow Creek Association trained pastors from over 90 countries. Hybels wrote the playbook that megachurches across America copied and adapted. Then allegations of sexual misconduct emerged. Multiple women came forward. The church's own internal investigation found the claims credible. Hybels resigned in 2018, and since then, Willow Creek has cycled through multiple leadership transitions, attendance collapses, and an ongoing identity crisis. The church that once told everyone else how to grow is now trying to figure out how to survive. The pattern is consistent. Founder builds something enormous based on personal charisma, personal relationships, personal brand. Founder retires or is forced out. Successor inherits the structure, but not the intangibles that made it work. Empire fractures. Andy Wood inherited 20,000 weekly attendees, but he didn't inherit the relationships Warren built over 4 decades. He didn't inherit the trust Warren accumulated with denominational leaders. He didn't inherit the cultural moment that made the purpose-driven life a phenomenon. He inherited a building, he inherited a payroll, and he inherited a war he didn't start. Saddleback still operates today. Multiple campuses across Southern California, services every weekend, staff still employed. By most metrics, it's still a large and functioning church. But the momentum is gone. The gravitational pull that once made Saddleback the center of the evangelical universe has dissipated. Pastors who once flew across the country to attend Saddleback conferences now point to the expulsion as evidence of what happens when a church prioritizes relevance over doctrine. The purpose-driven brand hasn't disappeared, but it's been redefined. It's no longer synonymous with innovation. It's synonymous with a gamble that didn't pay off. And Andy Wood is left holding the cards. 8 months. That's how long it took for everyone to realize that this succession was never really about Andy Wood at all. It was about Rick Warren making a decision he knew would be controversial, timing his exit before the consequences landed, and letting his successor absorb the impact. Wood was handed a church that had just been expelled from everything it claimed to stand for. A congregation that suddenly had to redefine its identity. A staff wondering whether the vision they'd committed their careers to was about to collapse. Some empires can be inherited. The founder builds the structure, establishes the systems, creates something that can outlive them. But purpose-driven Saddleback wasn't that kind of empire. It was built on one man's relationships, one man's reputation, one man's willingness to push boundaries. And when that man walked away, he didn't leave a foundation. He left a countdown. If you've been watching this channel, you know this isn't the first time a megachurch transition has gone sideways. The video on screen right now breaks down another succession that fell apart for completely different reasons. Subscribe if you want to understand how these empires actually work. Because the cracks are always there. You just have to know where to look.